Hi, I'm Dr. Walter Matwichuk, and I'm here to talk to you about reasonable expectations with regards to transforming your unhealthy attitudes into healthy ones. After a demonstration I recently did, someone said, "What do you do?" And you've person says it makes sense, but unfortunately, they haven't had a profound emotional change when they've seen that the healthy attitudes that we teach in REBT make logical sense, but then they are unable to really feel differently. And the first thing I encourage people to do is to see that psychotherapy is a process where we learn by repetition. That it's important to have realistic expectations that you're not just going to have a session with somebody and suddenly a person's going to miraculously change their fundamental attitudes about themselves, others, and life. If only it were that easy. Essentially, people will need to revisit their attitudes that are self defeating and challenge them each day. Athletes go to the gym, train, rest, and then come back to the gym on a regular basis, having the expectation that it's regular training that will ultimately lead to increased strength and endurance. And what we're saying in REBT is the same goes with your emotional training. That if you've for a long time believed that you have to do perfectly well or else you're lesser of a person, one conversation about giving up that self defeating attitude and unconditionally accepting yourself isn't going to magically make you different. You're going to need to revisit this attitude multiple times. And what I suggest people do is to come back to it on a regular basis and examine the evidence, think through the idea that they don't have to perform perfectly well and that they can unconditionally accept themselves, choose to accept themselves, and that they can revisit this attitude through different avenues of attack. So, for example, in REBT, we talk about a functional challenge where people examine how they don't function well when they demand perfection of themselves and how they do better when they hold a preference for doing ideally well, but they don't demand it. They see that anxiety results from demanding to do perfectly well, and then they very often fear failure and they don't take calculated risks. What we would argue is that you could do a functional challenge like that, but you could also do an empirical one where you examine the evidence that shows that in your heart you want to do ideally well, but there's no empirical evidence that establishes or proves the idea that you have to. The universe will allow you to perform imperfectly. It certainly allows me to perform imperfectly, so I don't see why it wouldn't allow you to perform imperfectly. And it also allows you to choose to accept yourself unconditionally, even when you make errors, when you make faulty assumptions, when you fall flat on your face. So a second line of attack is to examine the empirical evidence on a regular basis and really think through the idea that you don't have to do ideally well. Now, there are other disputes. You can do what we call is a logical dispute. And very often what people have are tacit attitudes that go unsaid. So, for example, they may be aware they're perfectionistic and that they sometimes will acknowledge that they have to do perfectly well, but they won't see the premise on which that demand is based. And very often people have implicit ideas in their head like, well, because a lot is resting on a good performance, therefore I have to perform perfectly well. Or because other people expect me to do ideally well, therefore I have to do perfectly well. And what we show people in REBT is that the premise that because other people want us to do ideally well, it doesn't logically follow for us to conclude that therefore we must not let them down, that we have to perform perfectly well. So, a logical dispute would be to remind yourself that even though others want you to do very well, it still does not logically follow that you have to do perfectly well. Now, in addition to that, you can also write down your answers, because very often what people will do is say, well, I know I don't have to do perfectly well, or I can make mistakes, but then they really don't think through why that is true. And so sometimes when we write down the reasons that we don't have to do perfectly or well, or how we function poorly when we demand perfection, and how we function far better when we don't demand perfection, that we allow ourselves to do as well as we can at any given time. The act of writing down the reasons and the logic behind a healthy attitude could very well help you internalize it. The other thing you can do is you can mentally practice a healthy attitude. So, for example, you could picture yourself doing something imperfectly. Say, if you're a figure skater, you could picture yourself, attempting to skate a perfect routine. And then you could, while you see yourself making some errors, you could say to yourself, I don't have to do perfectly well. I want to. It's not the end of the world if I don't do perfectly well. Finally, you can also, to help yourself train to discipline your mind, you can show other people how they're making demands on themselves, and you could teach them REBT. Now, you don't want to cram this down their throat. Some people aren't interested, but you could also model for them REBT if you don't necessarily talk to them explicitly about it. But the point being is that you need to have realistic expectations. People are usually well practiced in their rigid and extreme attitudes, which lead to their emotional disturbance. And unlearning or cultivating healthy alternative attitudes is not going to occur overnight. And so it's not so much that REBT is not going to help you or you can't do it, but that you're going to need to regularly challenge yourself and the thinking behind your demand until you eventually give it up, and then you could regularly also rehearse the alternative attitude that no matter how much I want to do ideally well, I still don't have to. And then you could see that you have to maintain this healthy attitude, because like athletes who have to maintain their physical fitness, it's very easy for humans to lose their healthy attitudes and resort back to old ways of thinking where they demand perfection from themselves or other people. Albert Ellis, the originator of REBT, would argue that we are biologically predisposed to rigid and extreme attitudes, and this is a very strong tendency that's more or less baked into our humanity. We in REBT might acknowledge that our environment can teach us to think irrationally, or even give us the content of what we think about. But ultimately, it's our human nature to go from saying, I want to do well, and then jump to, I have to do well. And that we need to constantly resist this tendency to take our preferences for what occurs and our preferences for what doesn't occur, and keep them at the level of preferences that the human mind naturally wants to jump to. Because I want something very badly, I have to have it. And that's the main message of REBT that you want to get through your head, which is that you never have to have what you want, no matter how badly you want it. Now, that can be a bitter pill to swallow, but once you get it, you have a profound philosophical change, and that enables you then to cope with reality as it is. Sometimes you'll get what you want, and sometimes you won't. Sometimes you will not get what you want initially, but if you work at it, you still may get what you want. But even if you work at it, you still may fail. And if you hold the rigid attitude that you have to succeed, then you'll jump to, I'm an unacceptable person, I'm lesser of a person, or even a bad person. And we want you to give up that idea that you're a bad person and give up your rigid thinking that you have to perform perfectly well. But this is going to be something that you got to do over time. So it's really important that you have realistic expectations about exactly how long it will take you to introduce the F word into your thinking. That's right, the F word. And what I mean by that is flexibility. It's hard for humans to stay flexible. We easily insist and demand that ourselves and other people in life conform to our wishes. Sadly, in this world, we don't have to get what we want, and we better drill that into our heads so that we can adapt to reality as it is. Now, I hold a demonstration every Saturday that you can attend and watch me try to teach this flexibility to a volunteer who's willing to discuss a real message, willing to discuss a real problem. You see, I sometimes not perform perfectly well, and it doesn't kill me. In any event, you can attend these demonstrations, and they're free to attend, and you'll learn a great deal about how to challenge your thinking, and they can even inspire you on a weekly basis to stay with the process of personal growth and keep the REBT fresh in your mind. They're free to attend. They're on Saturday mornings here in New York at 9 a.m. So you may be in some part of the world, so you'll have to do a little math and figure out what time 9 a.m. in New York is in your neck of the woods. If you write to me at rebtdoctor@gmail.com, that's rebtdoctor@gmail.com, I promise to send you the link, and you can attend one of our demonstrations, or you can attend every week and begin to cultivate healthy attitudes that'll help you accept yourself and other people and life itself, but you'll have to work at it. I hope to see you on Saturday, but more importantly, I hope you introduce the F word into your thinking, flexibility.